They thought they had bought second-hand goods to survive, but in the basement, behind a hidden wall, they found a collection that criminals had been hunting for decades. No one expected what happened next. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching from. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and the streets of the town looked as though they had been painted in shades of gray and rust. The neon sign of the laundromat blinked weakly across from the Harris's apartment window, casting pale light into a living room cluttered with unpaid bills, half-finished school projects, and the stale air of quiet despair. Emily Harris sat on the threadbare couch, her fingers curled around the handle of a chipped mug of lukewarm tea, while her husband James leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the floor as if the linoleum itself might reveal an answer to their troubles. Neither of them spoke at first. Words had become dangerous things, fragile, and they both knew that if they let their frustration out too quickly, it might cut deeper than either intended. It was Emily who broke the silence. She unfolded a damp flyer she had picked up on her way home from school, the corners already softened by the rain. "They're selling a second-hand shop on the east side," she said carefully, her voice carrying that cautious hopefulness that James had learned to fear as much as to admire. "It's cheap. Really cheap. Less than what we'd spend in a year on rent here." James lifted his gaze slowly, suspicion flickering behind his tired eyes. He had spent the last 2 months sending out resumes that went unanswered, pacing their narrow apartment as though the walls were slowly shrinking. He was not in the mood for hope that came folded on a piece of paper. "Cheap because it's worthless," he muttered, but his voice lacked real conviction. He took the flyer from her hand, read the simple print. "Second-hand shop for sale. Inventory included. Low price. Call for details." Emily did not back down. She leaned forward, the mug warming her palms. "Even if it's a wreck, it's ours. We'd have a place. Something we can build together." She looked at him in the way she always did when she was trying to remind him of who he used to be. Steady, ambitious, a man who once believed in small beginnings. By the following week, they had drained their meager savings, signed the papers with a notary who barely looked up from his desk, and carried the single brass key across town to the building that was now, improbably, theirs. The shop stood at the end of a narrow street, sandwiched between an abandoned hardware store and a boarded-up diner. Its faded sign still read, "Wainwright's Second-Hand Treasures," though most of the letters had rusted or fallen away, leaving only Wayne. Hand. Res. The windows were cloudy with grime, and the front door groaned as though complaining about being disturbed after years of neglect. Emily felt a strange thrill, as though she were stepping into a forgotten story, while James kept his jaw tight, determined not to show disappointment at the sight of what they had risked their future on. Inside, the smell hit them first, a mix of mothballs, old wood, and something damp that clung to the corners of the walls. Dust floated in the pale light that struggled through the dirty windows, catching on piles of outdated clothing, stacks of faded magazines, and chipped furniture that looked as though it had been placed there decades ago and never moved again. The shelves sagged under the weight of forgotten things, and cobwebs stretched lazily from one cracked display case to another. James walked through the aisles with slow steps, kicking at a collapsed box that spilled its contents of tangled cords and yellowed paperbacks. "This is what we bought," he said flatly. "This is what we emptied our account for." But Emily was already moving toward the counter at the back, where a dusty cash register sat like a relic of another time. She touched the wood beneath her fingertips, and instead of despair, she felt a strange sense of possibility. The shop was not dead. It was sleeping. She could imagine new paint on the walls, fresh shelves, warm light. She could imagine people coming in, browsing, laughing, buying, filling the place with life again. Behind the counter, half hidden under a pile of boxes, was a door that led to the basement. When James pulled at the handle, it rattled, but didn't open. The lock had rusted shut. He frowned, gave it another tug, and the sound of cracking wood echoed faintly in the quiet. "Strange," he murmured. The deed mentioned a basement. The next few days passed in a haze of cleaning and sorting. Emily scrubbed shelves until her hands ached, while James hauled broken furniture to the dumpster out back. They discovered forgotten relics of the shop's past, old ledgers with faded handwriting, receipts dated decades ago, photographs of the previous owner standing proudly by the front door in a suit too big for his frame. Each discovery deepened the mystery of why the shop had been sold so cheaply, but they pushed those thoughts aside, telling themselves it was simply neglect, nothing more. On the fourth evening, when the air grew heavy with the smell of rain-soaked asphalt outside, James returned to the stubborn basement door with a crowbar. The sound of splintering wood rang out as he forced it open, and a rush of cold, musty air swept upward, carrying the scent of something that had not been touched in years. They descended together, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The basement was larger than expected, stretching farther under the building than the size of the shop above suggested. The floor was concrete, cracked in places, and the walls were lined with wooden shelves filled with boxes that sagged under the weight of time. Emily's heart beat faster as she brushed her hand along the wall. The beam of her flashlight caught on something unusual, a panel that did not quite match the rest. Its color was different, the wood newer, less weathered. She called James over, and together they pushed at it. It gave way with surprising ease, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The space behind the panel was small, but deeper inside, another door waited, heavy and metal, with a lock that had long since corroded. James set the flashlight down, wiped sweat from his brow, and set to work with the crowbar again. It took time, and the sound of metal groaning echoed in the basement like a warning, but finally, with a final crack, the door yielded. The hidden room was silent and still, untouched by the years. Rows of wooden crates stood stacked neatly against the walls, each marked with faded chalk numbers. Dust lay thick on every surface, yet the air felt strangely preserved, as though the room had been sealed with deliberate care. Emily approached one crate cautiously, her hands trembling as she pried it open. Inside, carefully wrapped in layers of cloth and paper, was a dress. No ordinary dress, but a couture gown from the mid-20th century, its fabric shimmering faintly even under the weak light. She gasped, reaching for James. Together, they opened another crate and another. What they found left them speechless. Shelves of pristine vinyl records, many signed by legendary musicians. Rare first editions of books, bound in leather and gold. Jewelry boxes filled with pieces that glimmered with unmistakable value. Every box revealed something more extraordinary, more impossible. James dropped to his knees, running his hand over a stack of records, as though trying to convince himself they were real. "Do you know what this is worth?" he whispered, his voice raw. "Emily, this isn't junk. This is millions." Emily felt dizzy, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath her. She looked around the hidden room, at the silent testimony of whoever had collected and hidden these treasures. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Why would anyone leave this here? Why not sell it? Why not use it? There was no answer in the darkness, only the weight of secrets long buried. They sat among the crates, their minds spinning, the enormity of what they had stumbled upon pressing down on them like a storm. For a long while they said nothing, listening only to the sound of their own breathing and the faint creak of the building settling above them. When they finally climbed back to the surface, the shop no longer looked like a forgotten ruin. To Emily, it was now a doorway into a mystery, into a future neither of them had imagined. For James, it was a temptation, a promise of wealth that had fallen into their hands. Neither of them realized that by opening that hidden door, they had stepped into a story that would soon entangle them in dangers far greater than unpaid bills and broken furniture. The second-hand shop had been sleeping for decades, guarding its secrets in silence. Now the silence was broken, and the Harris family had inherited not just a business, but a legacy and a threat that still lingered in the shadows. The night after the discovery passed in a haze of restless thoughts. Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling of their cramped apartment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the basement again. The crates, the careful wrappings, the glitter of jewelry, and the ghostly shimmer of gowns too fine for the dusty tomb where they had been buried. Beside her, James turned and shifted, muttering fragments of words in his sleep, as though even his dreams were weighed down by the enormity of what they had found. By morning, the exhaustion between them had deepened, yet beneath it flickered something electric, a nervous anticipation that neither could name aloud. When they returned to the shop, the daylight seemed sharper, the building less of a ruin and more of a mystery. James immediately wanted to return to the basement, to open more crates, to take inventory, to touch each treasure again, as if repeated contact might confirm their reality. Emily hesitated, standing in the middle of the dusty floor, her arms crossed, the cautious voice of reason rising within her. "We should be careful," she murmured. "If anyone knew about this." Her words trailed off unfinished. James gave her a look that was equal parts frustration and excitement. No one knows. That's the point. It's been down there for decades, untouched. It's ours now. For the rest of the morning, they busied themselves with sorting. James carefully unwrapped a stack of vinyl records, his hands trembling as he revealed a series of autographs from names that carried weight far beyond their small town. Emily handled the books, their leather bindings creaking as she turned the pages of first editions she had only ever seen referenced in libraries. They both knew, though neither admitted it aloud, that the value of what they were holding was staggering. Even selling one of these pieces could wipe away their debts, buy them a house, change their lives in an instant. It was James who first gave voice to temptation. As they sat at the counter in the late afternoon, the sunlight slanting through the grimy windows, he held up a signed record, with a grin that seemed foreign on his weary face. Imagine what this alone would fetch online. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. We could pay off the credit cards, maybe even get the car fixed. His eyes gleamed as he spoke, the words spilling out faster, as though he had been waiting all day to say them. Emily frowned, her unease growing. And what happens when someone asks where we got it? When people start asking questions we can't answer? This isn't a yard sale find, James. This is a hidden collection. It feels like it was never meant to be sold. She tried to keep her tone calm, but he could hear the fear in her voice. That night, while Emily cooked a modest dinner of rice and beans, James sat with his phone at the table. He took a photograph of the record, adjusting the angle so that the signature caught the light. He hesitated only briefly before posting it on a collector's forum, his heart pounding with both guilt and excitement. By the time they finished eating, replies were already flooding in. Offers, questions, urgent pleas for contact. James scrolled through them with wide eyes, his pulse racing. Emily noticed the glow of the screen, leaned over, and her stomach dropped as she realized what he had done. "Are you insane?" she hissed, her voice sharp with panic. She grabbed the phone from his hand, scanning the responses. Some were harmless enough, enthusiastic collectors marveling at the find. But others felt different, darker. Short messages offering cash with no conditions, requests for private meetings, people demanding to know his location. She slammed the phone down on the table. "You don't know who these people are. You could have just painted a target on our backs." James tried to defend himself, but the argument that followed cut into the night. He spoke of their debts, of their desperate need for relief, of how one item wouldn't matter. Emily countered with her fears, her sense that the collection was not theirs to strip apart, that they had stumbled into something larger than they understood. By the time they fell into bed, both were exhausted, the weight of their choices pressing down heavier than ever. 2 nights later, the first real sign of danger appeared. James arrived at the shop early in the morning to find the front door ajar, the lock mangled, the wood splintered. Inside, nothing seemed missing at first glance, but the unease in his chest was undeniable. He called for Emily, who rushed over, her face pale as she saw the damage. Someone had tried to break in, and though they had not reached the basement, the implication was clear. Someone knew or suspected that there was more here than dust and discarded clothes. They replaced the lock, their hands shaking as they worked, but the sense of safety had been shattered. That evening, as Emily swept the floor, she noticed a figure lingering outside across the street. When she looked again, the figure was gone. The next day, James swore he saw a car parked nearby that seemed to follow them when they left. Paranoia began to seep into their lives like water through cracked stone, slowly, inexorably. Then came the visitor. He arrived in the late afternoon, a thin man with sharp eyes and a polite smile that never reached them. He introduced himself as Arthur Wainwright, the nephew of the shop's former owner. He spoke in a voice smooth with practiced charm, telling them how much the store had meant to his family, how it had been a legacy passed down. He claimed that when his uncle died, much was left unresolved, and that he had come to check on the state of the property. James shifted uncomfortably under the man's gaze, while Emily forced a polite smile. Arthur's words carried weight, but he offered no proof, no documents, nothing to tie him to the inheritance he spoke of. When Emily gently pressed him for evidence, his smile tightened. "Paperwork gets lost over the years, but I know what's in that basement. My uncle told me, and I want what belongs to me." His eyes glinted with something cold, something that belied the calm tone of his voice. The encounter left them shaken. After he departed, promising to return soon, Emily sat at the counter, her hands trembling. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows what's down there." James paced the floor, his mind racing. "He doesn't have proof. Without proof, it's ours." But even as he said it, he felt the truth gnawing at him. The collection was no longer a secret between them. That night, Emily searched through old newspapers in the public library, desperate for answers. She found articles from decades past mentioning the shop's owner, a man named Charles Wainwright, who had been both admired and suspected. Admired for his passion for rare items, suspected for his connections to stolen art and smuggled antiques. Nothing was ever proven, but whispers clung to his name like shadows. When she showed James, his face hardened. If even part of that is true, then some of those things downstairs might not have been his to keep. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, staring at the floor. "Which means we're sitting on stolen goods." The revelation deepened their unease. It was no longer just about the danger of being discovered, but about the moral weight of what they had uncovered. Were they thieves by possession, inheritors of someone else's crime? The question hung between them, heavy and unanswered. Days passed, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. Cars idled on the street too long. Faces appeared in the reflection of the shop windows, only to vanish when Emily turned. The phone began to ring at odd hours, the line falling silent when answered. And all the while, the memory of Arthur's visit pressed on them like a storm on the horizon, a promise that the peace they had clung to was slipping away. Emily lay awake one night, listening to the creaks of their apartment building, her heart racing with every sound. She reached for James, who lay staring at the ceiling, his jaw tight, his mind elsewhere. Neither spoke, but both knew that something had been set in motion, something they could no longer control. The second-hand shop had once seemed like a chance for renewal, a small miracle in their otherwise heavy lives. Now it was becoming something else entirely, a trap, a magnet for eyes and hands that reached from the darkness. The treasures hidden beneath their feet had become a beacon, and in its light, dangers were gathering. They had opened a door to fortune, but with it they had invited the first shadows of peril, and those shadows were only beginning to lengthen. The shop no longer felt like theirs. Each time Emily turned the key in the lock and stepped through the creaking door, she felt as though she were intruding on a place that had already been claimed, as though unseen eyes followed her every movement. The air was heavy, the dust thicker, and the silence more accusing than ever. James tried to move with confidence, forcing a brightness into his voice whenever he spoke, but it rang hollow. They both knew that something had shifted since the visit of the supposed nephew. The collection in the basement was no longer just a hidden fortune. It was a secret, exposed, fragile and dangerous, dangling in the balance between desire and fear. It was on one of those tense mornings that Emily found the notebook. She had gone into the basement alone while James ran errands, her flashlight beam cutting across the rows of crates like a cautious hand brushing against the unknown. She had intended only to check that everything remained undisturbed, to reassure herself that the treasures were still there, untouched. But as she passed the far wall, her foot knocked against a small wooden box pushed carelessly into the shadows. Inside, beneath yellowed receipts and brittle scraps of paper, was a leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age. She carried it upstairs, her hands trembling as though the book itself might bite her. Sitting at the counter, she opened it and began to read. It was not a ledger like the others they had seen, but a personal notebook. The entries were uneven, written in a hurried hand, full of half-finished thoughts and scattered reflections. The owner of the shop, Charles Wainwright, had left behind fragments of his mind, a mixture of pride and paranoia, joy and regret. Some passages were filled with meticulous detail about acquisitions, dates, places, names of sellers whispered in secrecy. Others dissolved into ramblings about betrayal, about promises broken, about the danger of letting beautiful things fall into the wrong hands. Emily felt a chill as she read the final entries. They spoke of being followed, of men who wanted what was not theirs, of hiding the collection not just for safekeeping, but for protection. One sentence repeated itself like a prayer. They must not have it. Better buried than broken. When James returned and found her pale, clutching the book, he read the entries with growing unease. His expression hardened. So he knew, James said quietly. He knew people were after him, and if he was right, they're the same kind of people who are after us now. Their suspicions were confirmed sooner than they expected. That evening, the phone rang again, its shrill cry cutting through the quiet like a knife. James answered, his voice guarded, and a low, rasping voice spoke on the other end. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," it said, the words deliberate, menacing. "You can make this easy, or you can make it hard." Then the line went dead. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as James slowly set the receiver back in place. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier, the shadows deeper. For the first time, she wished they had never opened the crates at all. The next day, they found the front window cracked, a long line splintering across the glass, as though someone had struck it with a pipe or a bat. Nothing had been stolen, but the message was clear. The shop was no longer just a place of business, it had become a battlefield. Desperate for guidance, Emily insisted they seek legal advice. They met with a local attorney in a cramped office lined with dusty law books. The man listened to their story with raised brows, his skepticism plain. "Without documentation," he explained, tapping his pen against the desk, "you cannot claim rightful ownership. If this collection was hidden intentionally, it may be considered stolen property. At best, it could be claimed by surviving relatives. At worst, it could be seized entirely by the state or by rightful owners who can prove theft." His words struck like blows. They left the office more uncertain than before, with fear pressing closer at their heels. James refused to accept defeat. That night, long after Emily had gone to bed, he lingered near the window, staring at the street outside. A car idled there longer than it should have, its headlights off, a shape unmoving behind the wheel. The next day, he made a decision. He followed the man who had called himself Arthur. It was a reckless move, but desperation had clouded his judgment. Arthur met with others in a diner on the far edge of town, men who wore tailored suits too fine for their surroundings, men whose laughter carried a sharpness that made James's blood run cold. He lingered in the parking lot long enough to see the exchange of a folder, the shake of hands, the glint of money passing across the table. He returned to Emily pale and shaken. "They're not relatives," he said, his voice low. "They're connected. Criminals, collectors, whatever you want to call them. They've been after this for years." From that moment, the sense of looming danger sharpened into certainty. The shop was no longer theirs to enjoy. It had become prey, and they were caught in the hunt. The tension between them grew heavier. James grew restless, insisting they take what they could and sell it before it was stolen. Emily clung stubbornly to her belief that stripping the collection apart would betray something greater, something almost sacred. Their argument stretched into the night, both of them knowing that the longer they waited, the closer the danger crept. It was on a stormy night, the wind rattling the shutters and rain lashing against the roof, that the threat became reality. The back door shuddered with a crash, and heavy footsteps echoed in the shop above their heads. Emily's scream caught in her throat as James pulled her into the shadows of the basement, his eyes wild with fear. Voices filled the air, harsh and commanding. "Find it! They hid it here!" The intruders moved with purpose, not like thieves, but like men reclaiming what they already considered theirs. The sound of crates being overturned, shelves collapsing, glass shattering filled the air. Emily clutched James's arm, every muscle in her body trembling. They had nowhere to go, no escape. If the men found the passage to the hidden room, it would all be over. Not just the collection, but perhaps their lives as well. For long, breathless minutes, they remained in the darkness, listening to the destruction above, the thud of boots, the harsh bark of orders. Finally, the footsteps retreated, the door slammed, and silence returned. When they crept upstairs, the shop was a ruin. Merchandise lay scattered, the counter overturned, the window shattered completely. But the basement door remained closed, the secret still safe for now. Emily sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. James stood motionless, staring at the wreckage with a look that was not just fear, but fury. "They'll be back," he said, his voice hollow. "And next time, they won't leave without it." The collection that had once seemed like a miracle had become a curse. They had stepped into a story they did not understand, a game played by men far more ruthless than they had ever known. The question was no longer whether they could keep the collection, but whether they could survive it. And as the storm outside roared into the night, they both knew that the danger was only beginning. The morning after the break-in, the world outside looked deceptively calm. The sky was a pale blue, the sun climbing steadily over the rooftops, children walking to school with backpacks bouncing on their shoulders, as though nothing in the world had shifted. But inside the second-hand shop, the devastation was a silent reminder of what had happened. Shattered glass still crunched beneath their shoes. Shelves leaned drunkenly against the walls, their contents strewn across the floor like discarded memories. Emily stood in the middle of it all, her hands trembling at her sides, her face pale and drawn. James moved restlessly from one corner to another, lifting what he could, setting it aside, his jaw tight with anger. He was a man running on the raw fuel of fear and defiance, but beneath it Emily could see the exhaustion that was threatening to break him. They had barely slept, taking turns watching the windows, jumping at every sound from the street. When the sun rose, James finally sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. "We can't live like this," he muttered, his voice muffled. "We can't wait for them to come back and finish what they started." Emily sat beside him, her eyes burning. "Then what do we do? Sell it off before they take it from us? Run away and hope they don't follow?" She shook her head, her voice breaking. "We'll never be free that way. They'll always be out there, always watching." James lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time, there was no argument in him, no push toward quick profit or reckless risk. He looked defeated, and the sight of it broke something in her. She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly, as if holding him could anchor them both against the storm that pressed closer with every hour. It was then that Emily remembered the notebook she had found, the one she had only skimmed through before the intruders arrived. She pulled it from beneath the counter, opening to the final pages. There, written in Charles Wainwright's unsteady hand, was a single folded sheet pressed flat between the pages. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the lines, and a chill ran through her. It was a will, handwritten and barely legible, but unmistakably a declaration. Wainwright had left the collection not to his family, not to the black market collectors who circled him in life, but to the town itself. His words were clear. "These treasures are to remain in Blue Hollow, preserved for the people, not the market. Let them serve as a legacy of what was found and what was kept, not what was lost." Emily pressed the paper into James's hands, her voice quiet but firm. "This is our way out. This is proof that it was never meant for men like Arthur or those criminals. It was meant to be preserved. We can give it to the town, to a museum. We can end this." James stared at the will for a long time, his brows furrowed, his chest rising and falling heavily. Part of him still clung to the dream of freedom bought with money, of debts erased in a single sale, of security wrestled from the jaws of chance. But the other part of him, the deeper part, knew she was right. As long as they held the collection in secret, they would be hunted. As long as they treated it as currency, they would be dragged deeper into the shadows of those who had stalked Wainwright before them. Only by stepping into the light could they end the nightmare. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. They contacted the authorities, bringing the notebook and the will as evidence. At first, the police were skeptical, weary of what sounded like a fantasy spun by desperate shop owners. But when Emily led them into the basement and opened the crates, revealing the treasures within, the skepticism melted into stunned silence. Experts were called, historians and curators, their voices hushed with awe as they cataloged what had been hidden for decades. The story spread quickly, spilling into newspapers, television, and radio. Reporters arrived at the shop, their cameras flashing, their questions sharp. Emily and James stood together, their hands clasped, answering as best they could, their voices steady despite the fear still simmering inside them. The criminals who had terrorized them were not spared. Arthur Wainwright and his accomplices were arrested after the police connected them to illegal dealings, uncovered during the investigation. The nightmarish visits, the phone calls, the shadows outside the shop, they all ended with the clang of cell doors shutting on those who had stalked them. For the first time in weeks, Emily and James slept without waking at every creak of the floorboards. The collection was transferred under guard to the local museum, where restoration began immediately. But Emily and James refused to walk away. With the support of the town, they secured an agreement. The old second-hand shop would be transformed into a cultural center, a place where the story of the hidden collection could live on. It would bear not just the name of Charles Wainwright, but also the names of those who had discovered it, preserved it, and protected it. On the day of the grand opening, the building looked nothing like the ruin they had first stepped into. The windows shone clean, the shelves were rebuilt and lined with carefully chosen displays, the air filled with warmth and light. Townspeople crowded the street outside, their voices buzzing with excitement. For so long, Blue Hollow had been a place forgotten, a town sliding quietly into obscurity. Now, for the first time in years, it felt alive. Emily stood at the entrance in a simple dress, her hair tied back, her heart pounding with nerves. James stood beside her, his suit ill-fitting, but his posture proud. Reporters waited, cameras ready. Children jostled at the front of the crowd, their faces alight with curiosity. Emily cleared her throat, her voice carrying over the murmur of the gathering. "We came here looking for a chance," she began, her eyes sweeping the crowd. "We bought this shop, thinking it was a way to survive, to start over. What we found was more than we ever could have imagined. But it wasn't meant for us alone. It was meant for all of us. For this town, for the people who built it and kept it alive, even when hope seemed gone. Today, we open these doors not to sell, but to share. This collection belongs here, with you." Applause rippled through the crowd, growing louder, swelling into cheers. The ribbon was cut, the doors opened, and the people of Blue Hollow streamed inside, their voices filled with wonder as they saw the treasures laid out beneath the lights. The shop that had once been a tomb of dust and silence was alive again, beating like a heart at the center of the town. In the weeks that followed, life changed in ways Emily and James could never have predicted. Tourists began to arrive, filling the small cafes and diners, bringing money and opportunity to a place long forgotten. The streets felt brighter, the people prouder. And though Emily and James had not become wealthy in the way they once imagined, they had gained something far greater: respect, safety, and a purpose that stretched beyond themselves. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Emily and James stood outside the shop, watching families wander through the exhibits, their laughter spilling into the street. James slipped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We did the right thing," he murmured. "We gave it back, and somehow, we found more than we lost." Emily leaned against him, her eyes lingering on the sign above the door, now gleaming in the twilight. It read, "The Wainwright Legacy, preserved in Blue Hollow." Beneath it, in smaller letters, another line had been added: "Discovered and safeguarded by Emily and James Harris." She smiled, a soft, weary smile, the kind that carried the weight of everything they had endured and the relief of finally being free. For them, the story of the hidden collection had begun as a desperate gamble, a risk taken in the hope of survival. It had nearly destroyed them, dragging them into shadows they never wished to know. But it had ended as something else entirely, a reminder that some treasures are not meant to be sold, but to be shared. That sometimes survival means more than clinging to wealth. It means choosing legacy over greed, community over fear, truth over lies. And as the lights of the shop glowed warmly into the night, the Harris family finally felt what they had been chasing all along. Not riches, not escape, but a sense of belonging, of peace, of home. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.